The moment someone realizes they can repeatedly disrespect you without facing any consequences, the balance of the relationship begins to shift. Not because you lack strength, but because you have been following rules they were never interested in respecting themselves. The good news is that changing this pattern does not require louder arguments or clever insults. Sometimes a few calm, direct, emotionally neutral words are enough to completely change the dynamic. By the end of this discussion, you'll understand exactly what to say when someone tries to manipulate you, dismiss your boundaries, or quietly take control of the conversation. Have you ever left an interaction replaying every sentence in your mind, wondering why you stayed silent or wishing you had responded differently? If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. But this isn't about winning debates or proving someone wrong. It's about ending a cycle that keeps repeating. One of the biggest advantages manipulative people have is not their confidence or charm. It is your hesitation. They rely on your tendency to over-explain, defend yourself, or hope that if you just phrase things perfectly, they will finally understand how you feel. The reality is often much simpler. In many cases, they already understand your feelings. They simply place more value on maintaining control than on respecting those feelings. That is why endless explanations rarely change anything. Calm boundaries do. One of the most effective responses is surprisingly simple: that doesn't work for me. Those 5 words do not attack. They do not invite debate. They simply communicate that a limit has been reached. Stay with me, because understanding why those words are so powerful changes everything. People with controlling or manipulative tendencies often test limits before they decide how far they can go. At first, those tests may seem harmless. They interrupt you repeatedly, dismiss your opinions, joke at your expense, ignore your privacy, or expect special treatment. Each small moment is often less about the specific behavior and more about discovering what you are willing to tolerate. Boundaries only become meaningful when they are supported by action. If you repeatedly say something bothers you, but continue accepting the same behavior without changing your response, the message becomes clear: your limit can be ignored. Over time, the behavior often grows because there has been no real consequence. The opposite is also true. When you respond calmly and consistently every single time, people begin to understand that access to you depends on respectful behavior. This does not require shouting, threats, or emotional confrontations. In fact, dramatic reactions can sometimes feed the very dynamic you are trying to escape. Quiet consistency is often far more effective than emotional intensity. Imagine someone repeatedly speaks to you with disrespect. Instead of arguing, you simply end the conversation each time it happens. Eventually, they learn that disrespect ends the interaction. The lesson is communicated through your actions, not endless discussions. This is another reason long explanations can become a trap. In healthy relationships, explaining your decision encourages understanding. With manipulative people, every extra sentence may become another opportunity for them to question your reasoning, challenge your memory, shift the topic, or pressure you into changing your mind. A simple decision can turn into a long debate because they focus on the explanation instead of the answer itself. Clear statements leave far less room for manipulation than lengthy justifications. Sometimes the strongest response is also the shortest. Remember that, because the next principle reveals why emotionally detached communication often has far more influence than trying to convince someone who has already decided not to listen. Once you begin explaining every detail behind your decision, the conversation can quickly move away from your boundary and become a debate about whether your reasons are acceptable. They may question your logic, point out exceptions, accuse you of being inconsistent, or try to make you feel guilty for saying no. Before you realize it, you are no longer protecting your boundary. You are defending your right to have one. That shift is exactly where manipulative people gain influence. The longer you justify yourself, the more opportunities they have to keep the discussion going and slowly pull you back into their frame. Clear communication works very differently. Simple statements like, "I've made my decision, I'm not available," or "that doesn't work for me," communicate your position without inviting unnecessary negotiation. They focus on the decision rather than the explanation behind it. This keeps the conversation from turning into a courtroom where you feel pressured to prove that your choice is reasonable. Many people worry that speaking briefly will appear cold or disrespectful. In reality, clarity is not the same as hostility. It is confidence expressed through calm simplicity. You are not responsible for convincing someone else to approve of your limits. Once you stop over-explaining, you remove many of the openings that manipulation depends on. Conversations become shorter, emotional pressure decreases, and your decisions stay exactly where they belong, in your own hands instead of becoming topics for endless debate. Stay with me, because the next principle is even more important. The greatest strength is often not confrontation, but quiet confidence. Confident people do not need to overpower every conversation to protect themselves. In fact, direct confrontation is often something manipulative individuals know how to handle. They may escalate the conflict, deny responsibility, reverse the roles, or shift attention away from the original issue until everyone forgets what the discussion was about in the first place. The louder the exchange becomes, the easier it can be for them to redirect the conversation. Confidence changes the dynamic entirely. It does not depend on raised voices, emotional reactions, or having the final word. Instead, it comes from being comfortable with your own decisions and trusting your own judgment. A confident person can say no without guilt, disagree without becoming defensive, and leave an unproductive conversation without feeling the need to convince anyone. That quiet certainty removes much of the emotional energy that manipulation depends on. Attempts to provoke guilt, shame, or self-doubt become far less effective when your self-worth no longer depends on someone else's approval. Real confidence communicates self-respect without needing to announce it. It shows that your standards remain steady regardless of how another person reacts. You do not need to embarrass someone, dominate the conversation, or prove your value. Your behavior already reflects it. One of the biggest mindset shifts is understanding that you do not need another person's agreement before enforcing a boundary. Healthy relationships involve discussion and mutual respect, but boundaries are not requests for permission. They are personal decisions about what you will and will not accept. Waiting for someone who repeatedly ignores your limits to finally approve them often means waiting forever. The moment you understand that your boundaries do not require another person's approval, you stop asking for permission to protect your own peace. And that single realization changes every interaction that follows. The next insight may be the most powerful of all because it reveals what truly happens when someone realizes your boundaries are no longer negotiable. A boundary is simply a decision about what you will and will not allow into your life. Its strength does not depend on whether another person agrees with it, understands it, or believes it is fair. Someone with manipulative tendencies may criticize your limits, laugh at them, call you selfish, or insist that you are overreacting. They may demand long explanations or try to convince you that your boundary is unreasonable. Those reactions can make it seem as though your decision only becomes valid if they eventually approve of it. But that is not how boundaries work. Their opinion does not determine whether your limit exists. Imagine you decide that every time a conversation turns into shouting, you will calmly end the discussion and leave. The other person may tell you to stay. They may accuse you of avoiding the problem or refusing to communicate. They may become frustrated because you are no longer playing by the rules they expected. None of that changes your decision. The boundary is based on your actions, not theirs. Your responsibility is not to convince someone that your limit is justified. Your responsibility is to follow through consistently. This is where many people become confused. A negotiation requires two willing participants who are trying to reach an agreement. A boundary requires only one person making a decision about their own behavior. The moment you stop waiting for permission to protect your peace, your time, and your emotional well-being, you begin taking back control of your own life. If this discussion is helping you see these patterns more clearly, consider liking the video and subscribing for more insights. And if you've ever used one of these approaches successfully, share your experience below. Your story might encourage someone who is facing the same struggle. Now let's continue, because the next principle may be the one that changes everything. One of the biggest sources of influence for a manipulative person is your emotional reaction. The stronger your response, the more information they often gain about what affects you. Whether the emotion is anger, guilt, frustration, fear, or desperation, those reactions can reveal exactly which buttons are easiest to press. That is why small disagreements sometimes grow into exhausting arguments that seem to go nowhere. The real objective is often not solving the issue, but keeping the emotional cycle alive. Every intense reaction teaches them something about your vulnerabilities, making it easier to repeat the same strategy in the future. This does not mean you should ignore your feelings or pretend hurtful behavior has no effect on you. Your emotions matter. The difference lies in how and when you express them. Responding thoughtfully protects your ability to choose your actions, while reacting impulsively often gives the other person more control over the direction of the conversation. Calm responses, short statements, and consistent boundaries leave very little room for manipulation because there is almost nothing to argue with. Imagine someone insults you hoping to provoke a fight. A heated response may keep the conflict alive for hours. A calm statement such as, "I'm ending this conversation," followed immediately by action, removes the reward they may have been expecting. Without emotional drama, the interaction quickly loses its momentum. Emotional self-control is often misunderstood as weakness, when in reality it is one of the clearest signs of inner strength. It shows that your behavior is guided by your own values rather than someone else's attempts to upset or control you. That is also why short, firm statements usually have far greater impact than long emotional defenses. They leave less space for manipulation, fewer openings for debate, and far more room for you to protect your peace. And the next principle explains exactly why saying less often gives you far more power than saying more. Many people assume that the more completely they explain themselves, the more likely they are to receive understanding and respect. In healthy relationships, thoughtful communication often strengthens connection. But with someone who consistently manipulates conversations, long explanations can create more problems than they solve. Every extra sentence becomes another opportunity to question your thinking, twist your words, search for inconsistencies, or shift the discussion away from the real issue. Instead of respecting your decision, they begin analyzing your reasons. Before long, you are no longer protecting a simple boundary. You are defending your emotions, your priorities, and even your right to make your own choices. The conversation becomes draining because the standard keeps changing. Every answer leads to another objection. Every explanation creates another opening. This is why short, confident responses are often far more effective. Statements like, "No, that doesn't work for me," "I've already made my decision," or "I'm not discussing this any further," communicate your position without inviting an endless debate. They keep the focus on the decision instead of the explanation behind it. With less information available to challenge, there is less room for manipulation. Some people worry that speaking briefly makes them appear rude or uncaring. In reality, calm firmness is not the same as hostility. You can remain respectful without feeling obligated to justify every personal choice. Clear, concise communication also reflects confidence. It shows that you trust your own judgment and no longer depend on someone else's approval before making decisions. As your words become simpler and your boundaries become more consistent, conversations become much harder to redirect into exhausting arguments designed to wear down your confidence. Stay with me, because the next principle explains why respect often begins the moment your presence is no longer guaranteed. One of the hardest lessons many people learn is that respect often grows when access becomes connected to behavior. If someone can repeatedly criticize you, ignore your boundaries, manipulate your emotions, or treat you with disrespect while still receiving unlimited access to your time, attention, support, and energy, they have very little reason to change. Over time, unhealthy behavior stops feeling like an exception and starts becoming the normal pattern. Your attention is valuable. So is your time, your trust, your emotional support, and your presence. These are gifts that healthy relationships appreciate rather than expect. Manipulative people, however, may gradually begin treating them as automatic privileges instead of something earned through mutual respect. That is why asking someone to behave differently is not always enough. Words alone rarely create lasting change when there are no consistent consequences connected to repeated behavior. Making your presence conditional is not about punishment or revenge. It is about recognizing that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect. Imagine someone repeatedly insults you during conversations. Instead of arguing or trying to convince them to stop, you calmly end the interaction each time it happens. You leave the room, end the phone call, or pause the conversation until respect returns. The message is communicated through action rather than emotion. Over time, people begin to understand that access to you depends on how they choose to behave. Your presence is not something they can take for granted. It is something protected by healthy standards. When you consistently honor those standards without anger, drama, or lengthy explanations, you quietly change the entire dynamic. People who value the relationship will usually adjust their behavior. Those who refuse reveal something important about their priorities. Either way, you gain clarity. And sometimes, clarity is far more valuable than winning another argument. The next principle may be the most important of all because it explains why protecting your peace is not selfish. It is one of the strongest forms of self-respect you can practice. If someone continues ignoring your boundaries after you have clearly communicated them, the next step is not repeating yourself louder. It is changing your level of availability. You may choose to limit contact. You may shorten conversations. You may decide that they no longer have the same access to your time, attention, or emotional energy. These actions quietly communicate an important truth. Closeness is built on respect, not entitlement. The key is consistency. A boundary loses its strength when it is enforced one day but ignored the next. Predictable actions teach people what behavior will and will not be accepted. While manipulative individuals may never fully appreciate your feelings, they often recognize consistent patterns. When disrespect no longer brings extra attention but instead results in less access to you, the entire relationship begins to change. Your time, your energy, and your presence are no longer treated as unlimited resources. They become valuable because they are protected. One of the biggest shifts happens the moment you become genuinely willing to walk away when necessary. That willingness removes one of the strongest assumptions manipulative people often rely on, the belief that no matter what they do, you will always remain. As long as they believe there are no real consequences, they have little reason to change their behavior. They expect the arguments to end, the emotions to settle, and everything to return to normal. Once that expectation disappears, the balance of power begins to shift. Stay with me, because this final lesson brings everything together. If there is one idea worth remembering above all the others, it is this. Manipulative people rarely change because someone delivers the perfect speech, finds the perfect argument, or expresses the perfect emotion. Their behavior changes when the old strategies stop producing the results they once did. The moment you stop over-explaining, stop asking for permission to protect your boundaries, stop feeding unnecessary conflict, and begin matching your words with consistent actions, the dynamic starts changing in ways that endless debates never could. Your greatest strength has never been your ability to convince someone to respect you. Your greatest strength is deciding what you will no longer accept. Every healthy boundary you maintain, every calm response you choose instead of reacting impulsively, and every time you quietly step away from disrespect sends a message that does not require raised voices or revenge. It communicates self-respect through action. That is where genuine confidence begins. Respect is not something earned by sacrificing your peace or endlessly proving your value. It starts the moment you recognize your own worth and behave in alignment with it. When someone realizes they can no longer manipulate your emotions, ignore your limits, or assume your presence will always be available regardless of how they treat you, they are forced to respond to a completely different version of you. But that was never the ultimate goal. The goal was never to control another person's behavior. The goal was always to stop allowing someone else to control yours. And when your peace becomes more important than winning arguments, when your boundaries matter more than another person's approval, and when your self-respect becomes something you refuse to negotiate, you discover a freedom that no manipulative person can take away. That is the quiet strength that changes every relationship because it changes the way you choose to show up in your own life.